The sun hung low over the wide desert plains as Eli Montridge rode his tired horse toward Redstone Ridge. The land was open and quiet, the kind of place where a man could hear his own thoughts too clearly. Dry wind blew across the sand and red rocks, carrying with it the smell of dust and distant sagebrush. Eli didn't mind the loneliness of the trail. He had spent most of his life traveling from one town to another, helping people who needed someone brave enough to speak up when others stayed silent. He was small in size compared to most cowboys, with narrow shoulders and a lean frame that made his hat look a little too big on him. But his eyes stayed alert, and his calm expression rarely changed, even when trouble was close. That afternoon, as he rode closer to Redstone Ridge, he remembered the reason he was there. A family, an old widow named Mrs. Halston and her 2 children, had recently lost a small herd of cattle. Those animals were all they had left after years of hardship, and without them, they would have no food, no income, and no way to survive the coming months. When Eli passed through their small farm, he saw how desperate they had become. The children tried to stay hopeful, but their eyes showed fear about the future. Mrs. Halston tried to act strong, yet her voice shook when she spoke of the cattle being taken by a powerful man. She said his name quietly, as if saying it too loudly might invite trouble. Garrick Hale. People didn't call him the Giant for nothing. Even before Eli reached Redstone Ridge, he had already heard stories about the man, stories told like warnings. Hale stood taller and broader than almost anyone in the region. Some people claimed he had the strength to lift a full hay bale with one hand. Others said he once pulled a wagon out of the mud by himself. Whether or not those tales were true didn't matter much. What mattered was how the town reacted whenever his name came up. People lowered their voices. Some looked around nervously. Some changed the subject entirely. Few dared to question him, but the truth was simple. The stolen cattle had wandered onto land Hale claimed as his own, and instead of returning them, he marked them as his property. Everyone knew it. No one confronted him. Mrs. Halston begged Eli to let it go, afraid something bad might happen to him if he tried to help. Eli only gave her a calm smile and promised her he would try. He never promised success, only effort, honesty, and courage. That was the best he could offer. As Eli entered the town, the dirt streets grew lively with movement. People were finishing their day's work. Children chased each other around barrels. Shopkeepers swept dust off their doorsteps. A man tuned a guitar while sitting on a crate. The town was small but alive, with every building painted in warm shades of brown and red that matched the surrounding landscape. Redstone Ridge had a charm, but it was also a place shaped by fear of a single man. When the townsfolk noticed Eli, they didn't see anything unusual. To them, he looked like any wandering cowboy, quiet, plain, and maybe a little too skinny to handle trouble. But once they saw the direction he was heading, some of them exchanged uneasy looks. A few even whispered warnings to each other, because Eli was heading straight toward the saloon. The saloon stood tall at the center of town, made of heavy wood beams and wide swinging doors. Laughter, music, and the sound of boots scraping against the floor drifted out from inside. Eli's horse snorted softly as he tied it to a post and gave it a gentle pat. He brushed off the dust from his jacket and took a slow breath before walking through the swinging doors. The moment he stepped inside, the room shifted. Not completely. People still talked, cards still shuffled on tables, and a piano still played, but something subtle changed. A few eyes turned toward him. Not because he looked impressive, but because a stranger walking boldly into the giant's territory always caught attention. Near the back of the room sat Garrick Hale himself, impossible to miss. He sat like a mountain among hills, broad enough that the chair beneath him seemed too small. His beard was thick, his boots large, and his laughter carried across the saloon like a rolling drum. A group of men surrounded him, all loyal to him in one way or another. They had been playing cards, but now their attention moved toward Eli when he approached the table. Eli walked with steady steps, not fast, not slow, just sure of himself. He stopped a few feet from the giant's table. Someone nearby muttered something about the new cowboy being in the wrong place. Another man shook his head as if predicting trouble. But Eli didn't look at any of them. His calm eyes stayed focused on Hale. Garrick Hale looked up, surprised to see someone so small standing there with such quiet boldness. The giant tilted his head, studying Eli like a man trying to understand an object he'd never seen before. "You're a new face around here," Hale said, his deep voice carrying easily across the room. Eli nodded. "Just passing through." "And what brings a small fellow like you to my table?" the giant asked, one eyebrow raised. Around them, the room grew quieter. People glanced between the two men, wondering what would happen next. Some leaned forward. Some held their breath. Everyone knew that Hale didn't like being questioned, especially not by strangers. Eli spoke softly, but his words were clear. "I came to ask about a widow's cattle. They ended up on your land. I came to request that you return them." A hush fell over the saloon. Some people stared at Eli in disbelief. Others shifted uncomfortably. No one talked to Hale like that. Not directly, not calmly, and certainly not in front of an entire room. The giant blinked, then leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a loud laugh, full and booming, so big that the glasses on the counter trembled slightly. His men joined in, slapping their knees, elbowing each other, and staring at Eli like he was the funniest thing they had seen in a long time. "You?" Hale said in a teasing tone, still chuckling. "You're here to ask me for cattle? Son, you're too small for me to take seriously." The men beside him laughed even harder. Someone in the back snorted. Even the piano player stumbled on a note. But Eli didn't react. He didn't blush, didn't frown, didn't step back. He simply smirked, small and confident, as if he had already expected that reaction. "Maybe I am small," he said quietly, "but not where it matters." The laughter stopped slowly, cut off piece by piece as the meaning of his words reached everyone. Hale's eyebrows dropped slightly, no longer amused in the same way. The room grew still. A few people exchanged glances, surprised to see Eli stand his ground so gently but firmly. Hale wasn't angry yet, just curious. "And where exactly does it matter?" he asked. Eli met his eyes without wavering. "In courage, in truth, in doing what's right." There was no threat in his voice, no challenge, nothing disrespectful, just honesty. That honesty surprised the giant more than any insult could have. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. People watched silently. They didn't know it yet, but something in the room had shifted. Someone small had walked into the giant's shadow and somehow made that shadow feel less large. Eli didn't stay long after that. He didn't push further, didn't demand anything else. He simply nodded at Hale, turned around, and walked back toward the door. The entire saloon followed him with their eyes, amazed at the calmness he carried with him. Even the giant watched him leave, a thoughtful look beginning to form in his eyes. Outside, the sky had turned orange with sunset, and the desert looked peaceful again. Eli untied his horse and stroked its neck. He knew the situation was far from over, but he had taken the first step, not through force or size, but through quiet courage. And that was something even a giant couldn't ignore. The next morning, the sun peeked slowly over the ridge, washing Redstone Ridge in soft golden light. The town woke bit by bit, shop doors opening, roosters calling from behind fences, and workers stretching before heading to their chores. Eli Montridge had already been awake for hours. He wasn't the kind of man who slept late, especially not when he had work to do. Today, that work involved learning the truth about the cattle and finding proof strong enough that even Garrick Hale, the giant himself, wouldn't be able to ignore it. Eli walked through the quiet streets with calm steps, tipping his hat kindly to anyone who looked his way. Most people didn't know what to make of him yet. Some admired his courage. Others shook their heads, believing he'd made a mistake the night before by confronting Hale. But even those who doubted him couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope they hadn't felt in years. They whispered about the small cowboy who dared to speak boldly with no fear in his eyes. Eli wasn't interested in fame or attention. He was interested in fairness. His first stop was the small farm where Mrs. Halston lived with her children. The house was simple but tidy, with handmade curtains and a porch that creaked gently in the breeze. The widow was standing by the gate when she saw him approach, her hands folded anxiously. "Mr. Eli," she said, her voice filled with both gratitude and worry. "You shouldn't have gone to speak to him yesterday. I feared he might not take kindly to it." Eli offered her a gentle smile. "Nothing to worry about now. I only talked to him. That's all." He glanced toward the empty field behind her. "But talking isn't enough. I need to look around your land. See if I can find signs of where the cattle wandered." Mrs. Halston nodded slowly, though concern remained in her eyes. "You're a brave man," she murmured, "but I don't want your bravery to bring trouble." Eli shook his head softly. "Bravery doesn't bring trouble," he said kindly. "Injustice does. I'm only here to make sure that doesn't happen to you and your family." Her eyes softened. She stepped aside and let him pass through the gate. The Halston farm stretched across a wide patch of land, most of it dry from weeks without much rain. Eli walked the fields carefully, crouching down now and then to examine the ground. He looked for hoof prints, any broken fence rails, anything that told a story. The children, a boy and a girl around 10 or 11, followed him quietly, curious but respectful. They had seen grown men lose courage in far simpler situations, so they watched Eli with admiration. At one point, the young boy finally spoke. "Do you think our cattle are really on Mr. Hale's land?" he asked. Eli stood and brushed dust from his hands. "I think they wandered. Animals do that sometimes. But I also think someone should have told your mother when they found them. That's what neighbors do." The boy nodded. "But people are scared of him." Eli looked at the boy gently. "Fear can make people quiet, but it can't change the truth." By mid-morning, Eli had walked nearly every corner of the widow's property. He found the broken section of fence where the cattle had escaped, likely during a windy night. The ground told the rest of the story, hoof prints leading downhill toward Hale's land. But those tracks were days old. He needed fresher signs, something that connected the cattle to their current location. So Eli thanked the family and moved on. His next stop was the grazing area just outside town. Several cattle trails crossed there, weaving like soft lines through the dust. Eli spent a large part of the day walking these trails under the sun, studying every mark in the dirt. His small size made him quick on his feet and light enough not to disturb the tracks he examined. Locals passed by, watching him with curiosity. Some offered water, some offered doubtful advice. But Eli only nodded politely and kept working. What he found surprised him. Near the ridge, where Hale's property began, Eli discovered a shallow stream, one that still carried a trickle of water even in dry seasons. The hoof prints around it were fresh. Eli knelt down and studied them closely. He could tell they belonged to cattle, and not small ones either. These prints matched the size of Mrs. Halston's herd. But something else caught his eye. A few of the prints overlapped with boot marks. Someone had walked among those cattle, guiding them, not chasing or herding aggressively. The steps were steady, controlled. Whoever it was had not been in a rush. Eli followed the trail further, moving along the stream's edge until he reached a cluster of trees that offered shade. There, beneath one tree, he found something important, a piece of rope with red fibers that matched the Halston family's marking ropes. He picked it up, dusted it off, and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't smile, but he felt one step closer to the truth. Later that afternoon, he returned to town, not to rest, but to talk to people who worked near Hale's ranch. Eli wasn't the type to push or pressure anyone. He spoke kindly, listened more than he talked, and never used any harsh tone. At first, most people hesitated. They glanced around nervously before whispering that they couldn't say anything. Some apologized. Some walked away. But Eli didn't blame them. He understood fear. He just didn't let it guide him. Eventually, he found a young ranch hand named Tobias sitting on the steps outside the feed store. Tobias was quiet, thin, and looked like someone who carried too much worry on his shoulders. When Eli greeted him and asked a few questions, Tobias stiffened nervously. I can't say anything," Tobias murmured. "I work for Mr. Hale. I can't talk about his business." Eli sat beside him, far enough not to crowd him. "I'm not asking you to betray anyone," he said gently. "I'm asking you to help a widow and 2 children who have nothing. If you can't help, that's fine. But if you can, you might make their whole world better." Tobias stared at the ground, visibly torn. After a long pause, he whispered, "I didn't do anything wrong. I just saw things." "I know," Eli said softly. Another moment passed. Finally, Tobias spoke in a low voice. "The cattle, the ones you're asking about, they really did wander onto Mr. Hale's land. But instead of returning them, the foreman told us to change the marks on them. I didn't want to do it. I told them it wasn't right." Eli listened quietly. "I didn't help," Tobias continued. "I walked away. But I saw the men do it. They scratched off the old marks and put on new ones." Eli nodded slowly. "Thank you. You did the right thing today." Tobias exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Please don't tell anyone I said anything." "You have my word," Eli assured him. With that, Eli finally had everything he needed: tracks, rope fibers, and a witness. Not a loud witness, not a bold one, but a true one. That was enough. As evening settled in, Eli walked through town again. People took notice now, not because he looked different, but because something about him felt different. Word had spread that he'd been gathering information all day. Some people wondered if he had lost his mind trying to stand against Hale. Others secretly hoped for him to succeed. Eli stopped at a water trough beside the livery stable and washed his hands and face. The cool water refreshed him, but his thoughts stayed sharp. He knew tomorrow would bring the real test. He had no intention of fighting, threatening, or making a scene. All he planned to do was show the truth plainly. Sometimes, the quietest truth spoke the loudest. As he prepared to head to his room for the night, an old man sitting on a bench called out to him. "You're stirring up dust most folks here are afraid to breathe," the old man said with a thin smile. Eli tipped his hat politely. "Not trying to stir anything, just trying to do what's right." The old man chuckled softly. "That may be true, son. But even simple truths can shake a town." Eli didn't disagree. He only continued walking, his boots tapping softly against the wooden walkway. When he reached his room, he set the rope fiber on the small table by the window and reviewed the day silently. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel proud. He simply felt steady, like a man who had followed a path because it was the only one he could follow with an honest heart. Outside, the sky turned purple, stars beginning to appear. Eli lay on the small bed, hands behind his head, listening to the distant sounds of the town settling down for sleep. He knew tomorrow would bring questions, resistance, and maybe disbelief. But he also knew that truth, when spoken calmly and confidently, could stand taller than any giant. And that was exactly what he intended to show. The next day arrived quietly, but it carried a weight that everyone in Redstone Ridge could almost feel in the air. The sun rose slowly over the wide desert, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Birds called lazily from rooftops, and the dusty streets were still empty when Eli Montridge stepped outside his small rented room. He stood there a moment, letting the calm morning settle into him. Today would be important, maybe not for his own life, but for the widow and her children, and for a town that had forgotten how to speak up when something wasn't fair. He adjusted his hat, brushed the dust from his shirt, and walked toward the ridge with steady, unhurried steps. People noticed him as he passed. They whispered to each other behind hands, wondering if the small cowboy really intended to face the giant again. Some looked nervous, others curious, and a few gave him quiet nods of respect. Eli didn't walk with pride or show any sign of fear. He simply moved with a calm purpose, like a man who trusted the truth more than anything else. He left the main street and followed the path toward the ridge where the land widened and grew quieter. The wind here carried a soft whistle, brushing through dry grass and small shrubs. Eli walked along the stream he had visited the day before, checking the marks on the ground again to make sure nothing had changed. The hoofprints were still clear, the footprints still distinct. Everything he saw supported the story he had pieced together. As he stood examining the ground, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned slowly to see Sheriff Landon, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. The sheriff wasn't a bad man, but he was known for avoiding trouble when it came to Hale. The giant had a way of making even confident men uncertain. "Morning, Eli," the sheriff said, stopping a few paces away. "Been hearing your name a lot these last 2 days." Eli gave him a polite nod. "Morning, Sheriff. I suppose folks like to talk." "They sure do," the sheriff sighed. "And they're saying you plan on confronting Hale again." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll be honest with you. The man's not easy to reason with. Most folks don't try." Eli looked toward the ridge, where Hale's ranch sat like a kingdom overlooking everything around it. "Sometimes people don't try because no one ever showed them it can be done." The sheriff studied him carefully. "You're not planning anything dangerous, are you?" "No," Eli replied gently. "Just planning to speak the truth." The sheriff let out a slow breath. "Well, I suppose truth is about the safest thing you can carry. But still, I'll be around if things go sideways." He paused, then added quietly, "Be careful." Eli nodded and continued walking. The sheriff lingered for a while, watching him go before heading back toward town. By midday, the sun grew warm, and the air shimmered slightly over the sand. Eli stood near a tall rock formation at the edge of the ridge and waited calmly. Word had been spreading since morning. Tobias, the young ranch hand, had apparently told someone in town that Eli had been gathering evidence, that someone told someone else, and soon enough everyone expected a meeting to happen between the small cowboy and the giant. Sure enough, dust rose in the distance. A group of riders approached, 5 men, all loyal to Hale, and in the center rode Garrick Hale himself. He looked even larger on horseback, towering like a moving wall. His shoulders were broad, his posture proud, and his expression unreadable. The men around him watched Eli with a mix of curiosity and caution. Eli didn't move. He stayed where he was, hands relaxed at his sides. When Hale and his men stopped a few yards away, the giant climbed down from his horse. The ground seemed to shake slightly under his heavy steps, or maybe that was just how people imagined him. Hale placed his hat back on his head and looked at Eli with a slow, careful stare. "Well now," Hale said calmly. "Seems like you've been busy." Eli nodded. "Just asking questions. looking around. Hale's men spread out slightly, forming a loose half-circle. It wasn't threatening, their hands weren't on anything, but the formation made it clear that they were there to support their leader. The giant folded his arms. "This about the cattle again?" "It is," Eli said. His voice was soft but clear, carrying surprisingly well in the open air. Hale let out a thoughtful hum. "I told you last time. You're too small for this sort of trouble." Eli gave a faint smile. "Still not where it matters." A few of Hale's men exchanged glances. They were expecting Eli to sound unsure or nervous. Instead, he seemed steady, almost peaceful. Hale raised an eyebrow. "So tell me then," he said, "what's all this you've been digging around for?" Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the small rope fiber he had found. He held it between his fingers so Hale could see it from where he stood. "This came off one of the Halston family's ropes," Eli explained. "Found it near the stream on your land, the same place where the hoof prints lead." Hale looked at the rope piece, then looked back at Eli. "So cattle wandered. That happens." "Cattle wander," Eli agreed. "But they don't change their own markings. Someone did that." A ripple of quiet went through Hale's men. One of them shifted uncomfortably. The giant's expression tightened slightly. Not angry, not yet, but no longer relaxed. Eli continued. "I'm not here to make accusations without understanding, but I talked to people who saw what happened. They didn't want to speak at first. They were afraid. But they told me enough to know that the cattle weren't just found, they were claimed." Hale's jaw tightened. "Who talked?" Eli shook his head. "Their name isn't important. What matters is the truth." The giant took a slow step forward. His shadow stretched over the ground between them, wide and heavy. Eli didn't move back. "So you're standing here," Hale said, "on my land, with a scrap of rope and a story built out of whispers. And you think that's enough to challenge me?" Eli didn't raise his voice, didn't frown, didn't try to look brave. He simply met Hale's eyes with quiet honesty. "It's enough for me to stand here," he said, "because it's true. And the truth doesn't need size to stand tall." A long silence followed. Even the wind grew quiet, as if waiting to see what Hale would do next. Then footsteps sounded behind them. Sheriff Landon approached slowly, stopping between the two groups without saying anything. His presence didn't change the mood much, but it reminded everyone that this moment wasn't happening in secret. Whatever was said here would be heard. Eli stepped closer. Not too close to be rude, but close enough to show he wasn't hiding. He pointed toward the tracks by the stream. "Your land is big," Eli said. "So big it touches places folks forget about. But the cattle didn't hide. They followed the water." Anyone could see it. Hale stared at the ground longer than anyone expected. He looked at the hoof prints, the boot prints, the faded path leading toward his ranch. When he slowly lifted his head again, there was something new in his eyes, something thoughtful, something heavy. "Those cattle," Hale said quietly. "They were left on my land for days. No one came for them." "They didn't know where they went," Eli replied. Hale looked away for a moment, as though weighing the words he wanted to say. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I didn't take them for harm," he said. "The foreman made the call. I didn't ask questions." Eli nodded. "I believe you, but now you know, and knowing means you can make it right." The giant's men looked between their leader and Eli, unsure of what would happen. The sheriff waited silently, arms crossed but not tense. Finally, Hale let out a long breath. "I won't be known as someone who takes from a family that has nothing," he said. "Not if the animals truly belong to them." "They do," Eli said gently, "and you can help put things right." The giant stared at the horizon for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow, steady, like a huge tree bending in the wind. "All right," Hale said. "Bring the widow to my ranch this evening. I'll return what's hers." Eli gave a small nod in return. "Thank you." Hale turned and walked back toward his horse. His men followed, quieter than before. The sheriff exhaled in relief and tipped his hat at Eli before heading back to town. Eli stayed a while longer, watching the footprints in the sand and the sunlight glittering on the stream. The moment had passed, not with shouts or force, but with truth spoken calmly in the open. As he finally walked back toward Redstone Ridge, he felt the weight of the day settling in his chest, but it wasn't a heavy weight. It was peaceful, steady, and honest. Today had not been about size or strength or pride. It had been about courage, quiet courage, the kind that didn't need noise to be powerful. And as he walked down the trail, he knew the story wasn't finished yet. The final step, making everything right, was still to come. Evening settled gently over Redstone Ridge, softening the sharp lines of the desert and turning the sky into a warm mix of gold and rose colors. Lamps flickered to life in windows and chimneys sent thin trails of smoke upward as families prepared for supper. But for Eli Montridge, the day was far from over. This was the moment everything had been leading toward, the moment when the widow and her children would receive what was rightfully theirs. Eli stood outside Mrs. Halston's small farmhouse waiting quietly while the family prepared to leave. The air smelled faintly of bread cooling on the windowsill, and the old boards of the porch creaked under his boots. The widow stepped out first, smoothing her dress nervously as she glanced toward the trail leading to Hale's ranch. "Are you certain this is wise?" she asked, worry tightening her voice. "I don't want to trouble that man any more than necessary." Eli gave her a calm smile. "You're not causing trouble. You're simply going to collect what belongs to you." The two children came out next, their eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nervousness. They had grown quiet ever since their cattle disappeared, but now a small spark of hope returned to their faces. "Will the cattle know us?" the little girl asked in a shy voice. "They will," Eli replied warmly. "Animals remember the hands that cared for them." This answer seemed to comfort her, and she slipped her hand into her mother's. With a gentle nod, Eli led them down the road toward the ridge. The sun dipped lower behind them, casting long shadows across the land. As they walked, townsfolk paused to watch, sensing something important happening. No one said anything, but several people offered small nods of encouragement as the family passed. Word had spread quickly that Hale had agreed to return the widow's cattle, and curiosity mixed with pride filled the community. After a quiet walk, they reached the foot of the ridge where Hale's large ranch stood. The house was built sturdily from logs and stone, and a long fence ran around the property. Beyond that fence were the wide fields where Hale kept his livestock. The ranch looked peaceful in the soft evening light, but its size was still impressive, almost intimidating. Eli led the family to the main entrance where a warm lantern glowed beside the door. Before they could knock, the door opened, and Garrick Hale stepped out. The giant looked different in this light, still large, still strong, but quieter somehow, as if he had spent the afternoon thinking deeply. He removed his hat respectfully when he saw the widow. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." Mrs. Halston dipped her head politely. "Thank you for seeing us." For a moment, no one spoke. The children watched Hale timidly, unsure what to expect from the man whose name once filled them with fear. But the giant's expression held no anger, only sincerity. "Your cattle are in the back corral," Hale said. "I had the men gather them for you." The children brightened instantly, and even the widow's eyes sparkled with cautious hope. "May we see them?" the boy asked eagerly. Hale nodded. "Of course." Eli and the family followed Hale around the house. moving past the fenced fields until they reached a smaller corral near the barn. The moment the children stepped inside, the cattle lifted their heads, recognizing familiar voices and scents. The little girl ran toward the nearest cow, her laughter soft but full of relief. "They're really ours!" she cried. Eli watched the scene quietly, feeling a gentle warmth settle in his chest. The cattle seemed content, nudging the children as if greeting old friends. Mrs. Halston reached out and touched one of them, tears forming in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. Hale cleared his throat softly. "I didn't realize they belonged to anyone in need. If I had known earlier, things might have gone differently." Eli stepped closer so the widow wouldn't feel pressured to respond alone. "Sometimes mistakes happen," he said, "but what matters is how we fix them." Hale looked at Eli for a long moment. There was no resentment in his gaze now, only thoughtful respect. "You've got a strange kind of courage," Hale said. "Quiet but steady. Most men come yelling when they think something's been taken from them. You didn't." "Yelling doesn't always help," Eli replied softly. "Truth does." The giant nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "And I misjudged what really matters." Mrs. Halston stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Thank you for returning them. It means more to us than you know." Hale bowed his head slightly, humbled by her kindness. It was the right thing to do. As the children continued greeting their cattle, the sheriff approached from the edge of the corral. He had come to make sure everything went smoothly, though he stayed out of the way to let the family enjoy their moment. Seeing everything in order, he let out a quiet sigh of relief. "Well," the sheriff said softly, "looks like things turned out just right." Eli nodded. "Truth usually leads there." The sheriff smiled at him with genuine admiration. "Town could use more folks like you." Eli didn't respond with pride or modesty. He simply said, "Everyone has courage. Sometimes they just need to see one person use it." The evening grew darker, but no one felt the chill. The warmth of the reunited family seemed to brighten the entire corral. Hale stepped back, letting them enjoy their joy without interruption. After a while, Mrs. Halston approached Eli. "Mr. Montridge," she said softly, "we owe you more thanks than we can give." Eli shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just take your cattle home and keep moving forward. That's thanks enough." The boy stepped up, holding out a small wooden carving he had made. It was simple, a little horse shaped from scrap wood, but it was his best work. "I made this for you," the boy said shyly. "I wanted you to have something." Eli took the carving gently, turning it over in his hand. "It's wonderful," he said. "I'll keep it." The children smiled proudly. As the family prepared to lead the cattle home, Hale approached Eli once more. "You were right about something yesterday," he said quietly. "It's not always the biggest man who stands the tallest." Eli looked up at him with calm eyes. "Size comes in many forms." Hale nodded, as if committing the words to memory. "If you ever need anything in these parts, you come find me. Not many men earn my respect, but you did." Eli tipped his hat. "Thank you." The widow and her children guided their cattle toward the road, lanterns glowing softly as they walked. The sheriff accompanied them until they reached the main trail, then turned back toward town. Eli remained behind for a moment, watching the family disappear into the peaceful dusk. It was a simple sight, but meaningful. A mother and her children walking home with their rightful herd. Something that seemed small in the eyes of the world, yet carried enormous importance for the people living it. Eli felt a calm sense of closure. Another trail completed, another wrong made right. He walked back to the front of Hale's ranch, where his horse waited patiently. He placed the wooden carving from the boy into his saddlebag, knowing he would treasure it. As he climbed into the saddle, the giant spoke one last time from the porch. "You leaving already?" Hale asked. Eli nodded. "Sun will rise again soon enough. I'll ride with it." "Safe travels," Hale called. Eli tipped his hat once more, then nudged his horse gently. They began moving down the quiet road, dust swirling softly beneath the horse's hooves. The sky above glittered with stars, guiding him forward. He didn't know where he would go next. Somewhere the wind carried him, somewhere someone needed help. But he would ride there steadily, calmly, trusting his heart to guide him. Behind him, Redstone Ridge rested in peace. A giant had learned humility, a widow had regained hope, and a small cowboy had left a lasting mark not through force, but through truth and gentle courage. People in the town would tell the story for years to come. They would say, "The giant once told him he was too small." And they would smile as they added, "He proved size only matters in the places you can't measure."